I answered my phone to my daughter Jessica's screaming voice. "Show me Grandpa's will now." Her demand caught me off guard during my morning coffee. When I calmly explained that as executor, the will wasn't mine to simply hand over before the proper legal process, Jessica exploded. "You're nothing but a thief. You're hiding Grandpa's money." The accusation stung like a physical blow. My own daughter, whom I raised with love for 35 years, now viewed me as someone capable of stealing from my own father's estate. Everything changed that morning. My father, Frank, passed away just 3 weeks ago at the age of 92. We had always been close, especially after I retired from teaching high school history 6 years back. Dad built his wealth through decades of hard work, starting with a small hardware store that eventually grew into a regional chain of 6 locations. He sold the business 12 years ago but maintained investments that continued to grow his nest egg. One thing about Dad, though, he was intensely private about his finances. Even I didn't know the full extent of his holdings. The grief still felt raw as I sorted through his papers in his home office. I'd pause occasionally to look at the family photos on his desk. One showed him teaching me to fish when I was 10. Another captured the moment he proudly handed me my college diploma. The most recent was from last Christmas, with Dad surrounded by family, including Jessica and her brother Patrick. My wife Carol would have been the steady force helping me through this, but cancer took her 4 years ago. The house felt emptier without her gentle guidance, especially now when family tensions were brewing. Jessica had always shown a fascination with material things, even as a child. She wanted the newest toys, the trendiest clothes. Carol and I tried to teach her the value of earning what she wanted, but Jessica seemed to absorb the lessons only superficially. In contrast, Patrick, now 38, had spent countless hours with his grandfather learning about business operations, investments, and financial planning. He seemed to value knowledge over inheritance. The day after the funeral, our family gathered at Dad's house. Everyone was subdued, sharing memories over coffee and sandwiches. As people began to leave, Jessica lingered, helping me clean up in the kitchen. "So, Dad," she said, stacking plates with more force than necessary, "when do we go over the will?" "I assume there's a reading or something?" "There's no formal reading," I explained. "That's mostly a movie thing. The probate process takes time. Dad named me executor, and I need to inventory everything, file the proper paperwork. But we get to see what he left everyone, right?" Jessica interrupted, her eyes darting to the crystal vase on the windowsill. "I always loved that vase. Grandpa knew that." "Everything will be distributed according to Dad's wishes," I said carefully. "The attorney will handle the legal aspects." Jessica's lips tightened. I deserved to know what Grandpa left me. We were close. The following day, I met with Daniel Wilkinson, Dad's attorney for over 30 years. He explained my responsibilities as executor with the precision of someone who'd guided many families through the process. Frank was very specific about how he wanted this handled, Daniel said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. He valued privacy above all. The will becomes public record eventually, but he asked that details remain confidential within the family until everything is properly filed. "My daughter's already asking questions," I admitted. Daniel nodded knowingly. "Frank anticipated that. He left this for you." He handed me a sealed envelope with my name in Dad's distinctive handwriting. At home, I read the letter inside. Dad's words were clear. "Nathaniel, I trust you to handle my affairs with the same integrity you've shown throughout your life. There will be pressure from certain family members. Stand firm. There are reasons for my decisions that will become apparent in time." Jessica began calling daily, her questions growing more pointed, her tone more agitated. "The attorney said it could be months before everything settled," I told her during one particularly tense call. "Months? That's ridiculous. What's taking so long?" Her voice had an edge I rarely heard directed at me. "Dad's estate isn't simple, Jess. There are investments, properties, tax considerations." "Well, can you at least tell me what he left me specifically?" "I'm following the process Dad wanted," I said firmly. "Everything will be disclosed properly when the time comes." That night I found myself looking through old photo albums, Pictures of Jessica as a smiling toddler on my shoulders, her proudly holding up her first bicycle without training wheels. Her high school graduation with Carol and me beaming beside her. Where had that happy child gone? Patrick called the next day. As the more level-headed of my children, he'd always been my sounding board. "Jessica called me last night," he said, his tone measured. "She's convinced you're hiding something about Grandpa's estate." "What would I be hiding?" I asked, genuinely confused. "She mentioned something about Grandpa having offshore accounts. Said he once mentioned something to her about investments in the Cayman Islands." I nearly laughed. Dad never had offshore accounts. He barely trusted banks outside our county. "That's what I thought," Patrick said. "Look, Dad, just so you know, Jessica and Doug are having money problems. Doug lost his job 3 months ago. They didn't want anyone to know." This new information cast Jessica's behavior in a different light, but before I could formulate a plan to help without overstepping, my doorbell rang one Saturday morning. I opened it to find Jessica and her husband Doug standing on my porch, both with expressions that made my stomach tighten. "We need to talk," Jessica announced, pushing past me into the house, "about Grandpa's will." "Good morning to you too," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Cut the small talk, Dad. We know you're dragging this out on purpose." Jessica's voice had the same accusatory edge as on the phone. Doug, normally affable, stood silently behind her, his gaze fixed on the floor. I invited them into the living room, offering coffee, which they declined. "Show us the will," Jessica demanded once we were seated. "It's been nearly a month. The estate is still being processed," I explained, for what felt like the 100th time. "There are legal procedures designed to help you hide assets," Jessica interrupted. "Grandpa told me he had substantial investments. Secret accounts you probably don't want us to know about." The accusation was so absurd I momentarily lost words. "Jessica, that's simply not true." "Then prove it. Show us the documents." I took a deep breath, went to my office, and returned with the limited probate documents I could legally share. "This is what I can show you at this stage." The initial filing with the court. Jessica snatched the papers, scanning them with narrowed eyes. "This tells us nothing. Where's the list of assets? The distribution details? Those are still being compiled," I said. "Convenient," she snapped. "Meanwhile, you have access to everything." "Jessica," I said, trying to maintain calm, "I'm the executor. That means I have responsibilities, not privileges. I can't touch a penny of Dad's money. He promised me his gold watch collection," she said suddenly, "and the antique desk in his study. I want to pick those up today." This was news to me. Dad never mentioned that to me. "Of course he wouldn't tell you. He knew you'd try to keep them." The conversation deteriorated from there. By the time they left, Jessica was barely speaking to me, and Doug had managed only apologetic glances over his shoulder. Later that evening, Patrick called again. "Jessica reached out to me with some wild theories," he said with a sigh. "Something about Grandpa's gold watches? She claims he promised them to her," I replied, exhaustion evident in my voice. "That's odd. Grandpa specifically showed me those watches last year, said they were going to be auctioned with proceeds going to the Veterans Foundation he supported." This was the first of many contradictions I would discover in Jessica's claims. In an attempt to clear the air, I invited both my children and their families to Sunday dinner the following weekend. I spent hours preparing Dad's famous pot roast recipe, hoping familiar comfort food might ease tensions. Patrick arrived with his wife Laura and their 2 kids, bringing a bottle of wine and warm hugs. Jessica and Doug came 20 minutes late, their greeting perfunctory. Conversation remained stilted throughout the meal despite my efforts. When Patrick mentioned a cherished memory of fishing with Dad, Jessica scoffed. "You were always his favorite," she said, stabbing at her carrots. "Just like you were Dad's favorite." The accusation hung in the air, as the children excused themselves to play in the living room. "That's not true, Jess," I said quietly. "Neither Dad nor I ever played favorites." "Really? Then why did Patrick always get special time with Grandpa learning about investments while I got ignored?" "You were invited to those conversations," Patrick interjected. "You said they were boring." Because he never talked to me about the interesting parts like where he kept his real money. The dinner deteriorated from there, ending with Jessica and Doug leaving abruptly after she accused me of conspiring with Patrick. Over the next week, I received calls from my sister in Arizona, a cousin in Florida, and two of Dad's old friends, all expressing concern about rumors Jessica had shared about my handling of the estate. The realization that she was actively trying to turn family against me cut deeply. My neighbor Walter, a retired judge, who'd become a close friend after Carol's passing, offered perspective during our weekly coffee. "Family estates bring out the worst in people," he said, stirring his black coffee thoughtfully. "I saw it countless times on the bench. Money has a way of distorting relationships. I never thought it would happen to us," I admitted. "Jessica and I were always close, especially after her mother died." Walter's weathered face showed compassion. "Grief manifests in strange ways. Sometimes it's easier to focus on material things than process the emotional loss." I nodded, finding comfort in his wisdom. "I just want my daughter back. Give her time," Walter advised. "But also maintain clear boundaries. If there's one thing I learned from 40 years in family court, it's that enabling poor behavior never helps anyone in the long run." Meanwhile, Jessica had begun ignoring my calls. Her social media posts contained vague references to toxic family members and standing up for what's rightfully mine. Patrick tried mediating, but found himself caught in the middle, unwilling to fully alienate his sister but increasingly frustrated by her behavior. During one of Patrick's visits, he confided that Jessica's financial situation was worse than I knew. "Doug's business venture failed spectacularly," he explained. "They invested everything, took out second and third mortgages. Now they're underwater, and creditors are calling." "Why didn't they come to me?" I asked. "I could have helped," Patrick shrugged. "Pride, maybe? Or they knew you'd ask questions about where the money was going." Before I could process this new information or formulate a plan to help, a certified letter arrived. The return address was from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was formal legal notice. Jessica was suing me for concealment of assets and breach of fiduciary duty as executor of Frank's estate. The court date was set for 6 weeks from now. The paper trembled in my hands as the reality sank in. My own daughter was taking me to court. The weight of Jessica's lawsuit hit me like a physical blow. That night I couldn't sleep, replaying our recent interactions and wondering how we'd reached this point. The accusations in the legal documents painted me as calculating and dishonest someone I couldn't recognize as myself. The following morning, I called Daniel Wilkinson, who recommended a colleague specializing in estate litigation. "You need Grace Thompson," he said firmly. "She's the best defense attorney for these cases." Grace's office was downtown, a modest space that spoke of competence without ostentation. She was a woman in her 50s with a direct manner and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "This is unfortunately common," she said after reviewing the documents. "Family members with unrealistic expectations about an inheritance often lash out at the executor." "She's not just a family member," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "She's my daughter." Grace's expression softened momentarily. "Which makes this harder, but doesn't change our approach. We need to be thorough and transparent with the court while protecting your father's wishes." The financial reality of my situation quickly became apparent. Grace's retainer depleted a significant portion of my retirement savings. Meanwhile, I discovered Jessica had hired Bradley Carson, an attorney known for aggressive tactics in family disputes. "He typically works on contingency," Grace explained, taking a percentage of whatever he can secure for his client. It makes him highly motivated to pursue every possible angle. Patrick visited after learning about the lawsuit, his face drawn with concern. I tried talking to Jessica again. She wouldn't listen. "She's convinced Grandpa was worth millions more than anyone knows, and that you're somehow hiding it." "Where would I even hide it?" I asked, gesturing around my modest home. "I've lived in this same house for 30 years. I know that, Dad. But Jessica's not thinking rationally right now." The court ordered a mediation attempt before proceeding to trial. We gathered in a sterile conference room at the courthouse, Jessica and Doug on one side with their attorney, Grace and I on the other. The mediator, a soft-spoken woman named Linda, tried valiantly to find common ground. Perhaps Mr. Robinson could provide a preliminary accounting of the estate's major assets? She suggested. Grace slid forward a document. We've prepared this summary of known assets as filed with probate court. Jessica barely glanced at it before pushing it away. This doesn't include the offshore accounts or the gold bullion. There are no offshore accounts or gold bullion, I said, struggling to keep frustration from my voice. Dad had investments? Yes, but they're all documented and being properly processed. You're lying, Jessica said flatly, looking at me with cold eyes I didn't recognize. Grandpa told me about his special investments. The mediation ended without resolution. In the hallway afterward, Jessica brushed past me without acknowledgement, while Doug gave me a conflicted glance before hurrying after his wife. My health began suffering as the court date approached. My blood pressure, normally stable, spiked high enough that my doctor prescribed medication. Sleep became elusive, my appetite diminished. I lost 15 pounds in a month. Walter became my lifeline during this period, listening without judgment during our coffee meetings, offering the perspective of someone who'd seen countless family disputes play out in court. Document everything, he advised. Every interaction, every memory that contradicts her claims. The court responds to facts, not emotions. Grace worked meticulously, preparing our response to each allegation. During our preparation sessions, she discovered something troubling about Jessica's attorney. Carson has a pattern, she explained, showing me research her paralegal had compiled. He takes on inheritance cases where there's little evidence but high emotion, convinces the client there's hidden wealth, then drags out proceedings to increase his contingency fee. You think he's exploiting Jessica's financial desperation? The thought that someone might be manipulating my daughter added another layer of pain. It's possible. His case is remarkably thin on evidence but heavy on inflammatory language. The pretrial conference arrived, a procedural meeting where both sides presented their arguments to the judge. Jessica sat across the courtroom, whispering occasionally to her attorney. She looked thinner than I remembered, dark circles under her eyes, her normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. Carson presented their case with theatrical flair, gesturing dramatically as he described me as a calculating executor who was manipulating the process to his own benefit. When it was Grace's turn to speak, she methodically outlined the proper steps I'd taken as executor, backed by documentation and timeline. Just when it seemed the proceedings would conclude routinely, Carson dropped a bombshell that left the courtroom silent. Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Robinson removed valuable items from the deceased's home before it was secured. Specifically, jewelry items that were promised to my client's mother. The accusation blindsided us completely. Grace recovered quickly, objecting to the new claim being introduced without prior notice. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Martha Sullivan, ordered Carson to provide any evidence within 48 hours. Outside the courtroom, Grace was furious. That's a typical Carson tactic. Throw in a new accusation at the last minute to see if it sticks. But the jewelry claim is completely fabricated, I said, still processing the shock. I never took anything from Dad's house. Then we'll prove that, Grace said firmly. But be prepared. This case just got messier. The accusation about missing jewelry required immediate investigation. The next day, Patrick and I met at Dad's house, which had remained largely untouched since his passing. Grace suggested we document everything carefully. We need to locate any jewelry and create an inventory, she explained over the phone. Take photos of everything. Dad's house was a spacious colonial he'd purchased after retiring, smaller than the family home where I grew up, but still containing decades of accumulated possessions. As Patrick and I began systematically going through drawers and closets, the experience became unexpectedly emotional, each object carrying memories of the man who'd been such a constant in our lives. In his bedroom dresser, we found a leather jewelry box containing his modest collection, his wedding band, a few tie clips, cufflinks from his business days. Nothing extravagant or particularly valuable from a monetary standpoint, though priceless in sentimental terms. "I don't see anything that would have been Mom's," Patrick observed, carefully photographing each item. "Grandpa never mentioned having any of her jewelry." In Dad's home office, we discovered something unexpected: a small, fireproof safe tucked in the back of his closet. The combination was one I recognized: Dad's military service number, which he'd used for various locks throughout my childhood. Inside were several folders of documents, including one labeled "Inventory" in Dad's precise handwriting. It contained detailed lists of his possessions, with notes about provenance and value. There was a jewelry section that matched exactly what we'd found in his dresser, with no mention of items belonging to Carol or any pieces designated for Jessica. More surprising was a personal journal, its leather cover worn from handling. I hesitated before opening it, feeling like an intruder in Dad's private thoughts. But Grace had emphasized the importance of finding any evidence that might refute Jessica's claims. The journal entries spanned the last 5 years of Dad's life. Many mentioned family visits and his pride in his grandchildren. But scattered throughout were concerning observations about Jessica. "Dinner with Nathaniel, Jessica, and Doug tonight. Concerned about Jay's spending habits. Third reference to needing money for investment opportunity this month. Asked pointed questions about my portfolio again." Another entry from the previous year was even more direct. "Jessica visited alone today. Uncomfortable conversation about my will and what specific items she might receive. Tried to redirect to more meaningful topics. Worry about her focus on material things, so unlike Carol." Reading Dad's private concerns felt invasive, but also validated my own observations. These weren't the writings of someone planning to leave Jessica substantial assets or making promises about valuable jewelry. When I shared our findings with Grace, she was cautiously optimistic. "This helps establish your father's state of mind and contradicts Jessica's claims. The inventory lists are especially valuable. They show he was methodical about his possessions." That evening, Patrick called with information he'd been reluctant to share earlier. "Dad, there's something you should know," he began hesitantly. "Jessica has a gambling problem. It started small weekend trips to casinos with Doug, but it escalated. She maxed out multiple credit cards. They're over $200,000 in debt." The revelation stunned me. "How long have you known?" "About a year. She swore me to secrecy, said she was getting help. I believed her until recently, when Doug called me in desperation. This explained so much: the financial pressure, the desperate belief that Dad's estate held the solution to their problems, the increasingly erratic behavior." "There's more," Patrick continued reluctantly. "I checked the security system at Grandpa's house. It logs entry with the alarm code. Jessica was there the day after the funeral, alone for nearly 2 hours. This was before you had officially secured the property as executor." My mind raced with implications. "You think she was looking for valuables?" "I don't know," Patrick admitted. "But with the new jewelry accusation, we decided to review the security system's footage, which was stored on a cloud server. The timestamps confirmed Jessica had entered the house using her key and the alarm code Dad had given family members years ago. The cameras in the main areas of the house captured her methodically going through drawers and cabinets, focusing particular attention on Dad's office. Most damning was footage showing her photographing documents from Dad's desk with her phone, including what appeared to be financial statements. I felt physically ill watching the footage. My daughter, whom I'd raised to value honesty above all, systematically searching her grandfather's house days after his funeral, before the estate process had even begun. Grace viewed the footage with professional detachment. "This is significant evidence, especially combined with the journal entries. It establishes a pattern that contradicts her court claims. But using this means publicly exposing Jessica's behavior," I said, torn between defending myself and protecting my daughter. "She's left you no choice," Grace replied gently. "She brought this lawsuit, made false accusations, and put you in this position. The court needs to see the full picture." That night, Walter stopped by with dinner, correctly guessing I wouldn't be taking care of myself. As we sat on my porch with sandwiches and iced tea, I confided the latest developments. "The hardest part isn't defending myself," I admitted. It's knowing that winning means exposing Jessica's problems publicly. What kind of father does that? Walter considered this thoughtfully. A father who understands that sometimes the most loving thing isn't shielding someone from consequences, but allowing them to face reality. Jessica needs help, not enablement. His words resonated with something Dad had often said. Love isn't always giving someone what they want. Sometimes it's giving them what they need. As the court date approached, Jessica rejected a final settlement offer that would have kept many details private in exchange for dropping the lawsuit. Her attorney's response indicated she was still convinced there were hidden millions at stake. The night before court, I sat in my study looking through family photo albums. Pictures of Jessica growing up riding her first bike, heading off to prom, graduating college. The smiling young woman in those photos seemed worlds away from the angry stranger who now saw me as an adversary. I slipped a particular photo into my jacket pocket. Jessica, at about 8 years old, sitting on Dad's lap as he read her a story, both of them laughing. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, I wanted a reminder of what we were all losing in this battle. The morning of the hearing arrived with unseasonable rain, heavy drops pounding against my bedroom window as I dressed in my best suit. The face in the mirror looked older than I remembered, new lines around my eyes, gray hair that had seemingly multiplied overnight. I tucked the photo into my jacket pocket, a talisman of happier times. The county courthouse was an imposing brick structure dating back to the 1930s, all marble floors and echoing hallways. Grace met me at the entrance, impeccably professional in a navy suit, carrying a leather briefcase filled with our evidence. "Ready?" she asked, her expression conveying both confidence and compassion. "As I'll ever be," I replied, straightening my tie one final time. We were early, but Jessica, Doug, and their attorney Carson were already waiting outside courtroom C. Jessica wore a conservative gray dress I'd never seen before, her hair pulled back severely. Our eyes met briefly before she deliberately turned away, whispering something to Carson. Other families waited for their own hearings, their tense expressions suggesting similar conflicts. Walter had told me that family court sees people on their worst days, and the evidence was all around us. Patrick arrived minutes later, hurrying down the hallway. He'd taken time off from work to be there, a gesture of support that meant more than he knew. He clasped my shoulder firmly before taking a seat on the bench beside me. As we waited for the courtroom to open, the tension grew palpable. Jessica paced the hallway, occasionally glancing in my direction with barely concealed hostility. During one pass, she paused directly in front of me. "You always were selfish," she said, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Mom would be ashamed of what you're doing." The invocation of Carol's memory hit me like a physical blow. Patrick started to respond angrily, but I placed my hand on his arm, silently asking him to let it go. This wasn't the place for another confrontation. When the court officer finally opened the doors, we filed in silently. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined, wood-paneled and formal. Judge Martha Sullivan entered promptly, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and reading glasses perched on the end of her nose. "Robinson versus Robinson," she announced, reviewing the file before her. "An estate dispute." Her tone suggested she'd seen many such cases before. Carson presented their case first, his courtroom demeanor even more theatrical than during the pre-trial conference. He painted a picture of me as a controlling, manipulative executor, deliberately hiding assets from rightful heirs. "Your Honor, my client simply wants transparency about her grandfather's estate and the valuable items promised to her," he concluded dramatically. "Instead, she's been met with stonewalling and deception by her own father." Jessica testified next, her voice wavering with what seemed like genuine emotion as she described conversations where Dad supposedly promised her specific valuables and hinted at special investments she would one day receive. "He told me there would be enough to secure my future," she insisted. "But my father is hiding the full extent of the estate." When questioned about the jewelry, she became more specific. "My grandfather had my mother's diamond necklace and earrings. He showed them to me once, said they would come to me eventually. Now, they're mysteriously missing." Judge Sullivan listened impassively, occasionally making notes but giving no indication of her thoughts. When it was our turn, Grace approached the proceedings with methodical precision. She presented the probate filings, the inventory lists found in Dad's safe, and expert testimony from the financial advisor who had handled Dad's investments for 20 years, all confirming that the estate was being handled properly and that its value matched the documented assets. When I took the stand, Grace guided me through explaining my actions as executor and my efforts to follow Dad's explicit wishes. "Did your father ever mention leaving specific jewelry items to Jessica?" Grace asked. "No, he never did," I replied honestly. And the items she described, a diamond necklace and earrings belonging to my late wife, were buried with Carol at her request. Dad never had possession of them. Carson's cross-examination was aggressive, clearly designed to provoke an emotional response. He repeatedly suggested I had mismanaged the estate and concealed assets, his questions framed to imply wrongdoing rather than directly accuse. "Isn't it true that you've been resentful of your daughter's relationship with her grandfather?" he asked at one point. "No, that's completely false," I replied, maintaining my composure. "I always encouraged their relationship." Judge Sullivan intervened several times when Carson's questions became particularly leading, her patience visibly thinning with his tactics. The most difficult moment came when Grace introduced the security footage showing Jessica searching Dad's house and photographing documents. Jessica's face flushed with anger or embarrassment as the evidence was presented, while Doug stared fixedly at the floor. This footage directly contradicts Miss Robinson's claim that she never had access to her grandfather's papers, Grace noted calmly. Judge Sullivan's expression remained neutral, but her questions to Jessica about the footage were pointed. Jessica claimed she was merely looking for sentimental items and trying to understand Grandpa's wishes, explanations that sounded hollow against the systematic nature of her search captured on video. As the hearing approached its third hour, an unexpected development occurred. Daniel Wilkinson, Dad's longtime attorney, entered the courtroom and approached the bench. After a brief whispered conversation with the judge, he was permitted to address the court. "Your Honor, I am Daniel Wilkinson, Frank Robinson's personal attorney for over 30 years. Frank anticipated the possibility of challenges to his estate and left specific instructions in the event that occurred. With the court's permission, I have a sealed letter Frank asked to be read into the record if his granddaughter contested the will." Judge Sullivan considered this for a moment before nodding. "The court will allow it." Daniel removed an envelope from his briefcase, broke the seal, and began reading, "To whom it may concern. If this letter is being read, it means my granddaughter Jessica has challenged my will or the administration of my estate. This saddens, but does not surprise me. For years I have watched Jessica's relationship with money with growing concern." The courtroom fell silent as Daniel continued reading my father's letter, his voice steady and clear. "Jessica has approached me numerous times over the past decade, seeking financial assistance. While I have occasionally helped, I became concerned about the pattern developing. Each request was presented as a one-time emergency, yet they continued with increasing frequency and amounts. In 2015, she requested $50,000 for what she described as a can't-miss investment opportunity. When I asked for details, she became evasive. I later learned from Doug that the money was intended to pay off gambling debts. In 2017, she asked for $30,000 to cover medical expenses. I gave her the money only to discover months later that there had been no medical issue. When confronted, she admitted using the funds to pay credit card debt. Most recently, 6 months before my writing this letter, Jessica visited and directly asked what she would receive in my will. When I deflected, saying I preferred to discuss family memories rather than material possessions, she became visibly agitated, suggesting I didn't trust her or value her as much as her brother. These incidents and others have informed my estate planning decisions. I have intentionally structured my will as it stands, with Nathaniel as executor. He has demonstrated financial responsibility and integrity throughout his life, and will honor my wishes without being swayed by emotional manipulation. The majority of my estate is designated for the Veterans Foundation I've supported for decades. Men and women who served alongside me deserve support in their final years. I've made specific provisions for my grandchildren's education and modest bequests to family members, all detailed in the will. Nathaniel receives compensation for his role as executor and trustee duties that require significant time and effort. This compensation was determined in consultation with my attorney and is standard for estates of this size. I love my granddaughter Jessica, but I cannot in good conscience leave her substantial assets that would enable destructive behavior. Instead, I have established a trust with specific conditions that might ultimately benefit her more than unrestricted funds. Frank Robinson. As Daniel finished reading, I glanced at Jessica. All color had drained from her face, her eyes wide with shock or disbelief. Doug placed his hand on her arm, but she shook it off, staring fixedly at the table before her. Judge Sullivan adjusted her glasses. "Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. The court would like to review the complete will at this time." Daniel provided copies to the judge, both attorneys, and me as executor. As we reviewed the document, Jessica's breathing became audibly irregular, her composure cracking. The will's contents confirmed everything I'd been saying. Dad's estate, while comfortable, wasn't the fortune Jessica had imagined. The largest portion, nearly 60%, was designated for the Veterans Foundation. Patrick would receive a structured inheritance focused primarily on education funds for his children. Jessica was to receive a modest sum of $75,000. Most surprisingly to me was a provision I hadn't previously seen: a separate trust fund for Jessica with specific conditions. If she completed a financial counseling program and demonstrated responsible money management for 1 year, she would gain access to a trust worth $250,000, with structured distributions designed to provide long-term security rather than a lump sum. "This trust is established with love," the will stated, "and the sincere hope that it will provide support without enabling self-destructive habits." Judge Sullivan reviewed the document silently for several minutes while the courtroom remained tense. Finally, she removed her reading glasses and addressed us directly. "Having reviewed all evidence presented, I find no merit to the plaintiff's claims of asset concealment or breach of fiduciary duty. The executor, Nathaniel Robinson, has followed proper legal procedures and acted in accordance with the deceased's explicitly stated wishes." Jessica made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Furthermore, the judge continued, "The evidence suggests the plaintiff entered the deceased's residence without proper authorization and removed documents, actions that could potentially constitute criminal offenses. However, as no charges have been filed, this court will not address that matter." She turned her attention directly to Jessica. "Miss Robinson, this court cannot enforce promises that were never made, nor can it create assets that don't exist. The will is clear, legal, and binding. I strongly suggest you consider the opportunity your grandfather has provided through the conditional trust." Case dismissed. With a sharp rap of her gavel, it was over. Grace gathered our documents, offering quiet congratulations. Across the aisle, Carson was already standing, briefcase in hand, clearly eager to exit a losing case. Jessica remained seated, staring blankly ahead, as though still processing what had happened. When Doug gently touched her shoulder, she finally stood, her movements mechanical. They headed for the door without looking in my direction. In the hallway outside, Patrick embraced me. "It's over, Dad. You did the right thing." "Doesn't feel like winning," I admitted, watching Jessica's retreating figure. Grace shook my hand firmly. Judge Sullivan could have been much harder on Jessica. "Consider this a merciful outcome." As we discussed next steps, I noticed Doug approaching hesitantly, having left Jessica with Carson near the building's entrance. "Nathaniel," he began awkwardly, "I just wanted to say, this wasn't my idea. The lawsuit, I mean." "I know, Doug." He looked exhausted, the strain of recent months evident in his posture. "Things are bad, worse than you know. We're 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank's starting foreclosure next week." "I'm sorry to hear that." "The gambling. he continued, his voice dropping. It started small. Weekend trips, a bit of fun. Then it became something else. She couldn't stop. I tried to get her help, but she always said she could fix it with one big win. I felt a complex mixture of emotions: sympathy for Doug, caught in an impossible situation, anger at what they'd put me through, and profound sadness for my daughter fighting demons I hadn't recognized. "What will you do now?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted. "Jessica's not speaking to me either at the moment. She blames me for not being convincing enough in court." He glanced toward the entrance where Jessica stood rigidly, staring out at the rain. "I should go." As he turned to leave, I found myself saying, "Doug, tell Jessica that Dad's offer still stands. The trust, the financial counseling, it's all still there if she wants it." He nodded without turning back. "I'll tell her. Not sure she'll listen right now." Patrick approached as Doug walked away. What did he want? To explain, I think. Maybe apologize in his way. I watched as Doug rejoined Jessica, who immediately turned and pushed through the doors into the rain, not waiting for him. "She'll need time," Patrick said, following my gaze. "Time," I agreed. "And hopefully help." The days following the court hearing passed in a strange limbo. The legal victory felt hollow without family reconciliation. I returned to the routine of my retirement morning walks, volunteer work at the local library, coffee with Walter, but everything carried the weight of unresolved conflict. "You did what was necessary," Walter reminded me during one of our conversations. "Now you need to find a balance between maintaining boundaries and offering a path to reconciliation." "If she even wants reconciliation," I said. "Jessica hasn't returned my calls." Walter nodded thoughtfully. "Healing can't be forced or rushed, but it also can't happen without opportunity." Taking his wisdom to heart, I continued sending Jessica birthday and holiday cards, brief messages letting her know I was thinking of her, all without expectation of response. I proceeded with administering Dad's estate exactly as specified, establishing the Veterans Foundation, setting up Patrick's children's education funds, and preparing the paperwork for Jessica's conditional trust. Patrick served as reluctant intermediary, providing occasional updates. "She's still angry," he reported a month after the hearing. "But she and Doug have put their house on the market. Downsizing before the bank forces them out." 2 months after court, I left information about the financial counseling program specified in Dad's will on Doug and Jessica's front porch while they were out: brochures, contact information, and a note explaining that completing the program would activate the trust Dad had established. I didn't know if she would use it, but wanted the option to be clear. The seasons changed. Spring brought new growth to my garden, which had been Carol's pride and joy, and which I maintained as a connection to her. I planted her favorite tulips and thought about cycles of renewal, wondering if family relationships might also revive after difficult winters. 3 months of silence stretched into 4, then 5. I continued my quiet outreach: a birthday gift left on their porch, emails sharing family photos I thought she might appreciate, always without pressure or expectation. In the 6th month after court, my phone rang one evening. Jessica's name appeared on the screen. My hand trembled slightly as I answered. "Dad?" Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, lacking the edge that had characterized our recent interactions. "Yes, Jess. It's good to hear from you." A pause. "I was wondering if maybe we could talk. In person." We arranged to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our homes' neutral territory. I arrived early, selecting a quiet corner table away from other customers. When Jessica walked in, I was struck by how different she looked. Thinner, yes, but also somehow lighter, as though she had set down a heavy burden. "Thank you for coming," she said, sliding into the seat across from me. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup but didn't drink. "I'm glad you called," I replied simply. For a moment, neither of us seemed to know how to bridge the chasm between us. Then, Jessica took a deep breath. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "What I did, the accusations, the lawsuit, it was wrong. All of it. Jess, please, let me get this out," she interrupted. I've been practicing what to say for weeks. Her attempt at a smile didn't reach her eyes. I was in a terrible place. The gambling took over everything. I convinced myself that Grandpa had millions hidden away, that you were keeping it from me, that one big inheritance would solve all my problems. She paused, collecting herself. It was the addiction talking. I've learned that now. I've been in counseling, not just financial counseling, but for the gambling. 12-step meetings, therapy, the works. I'm proud of you, I said, meaning it completely. That takes courage. Courage would have been asking for help before I dragged my own father to court. A tear escaped, tracking down her cheek. I said horrible things I can't take back. We all say things we regret when we're in pain. Not like that. Not to someone who's only ever tried to help. She finally met my eyes directly. I don't expect forgiveness right away. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did, and I'm working to be better. We talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation gradually shifting from apologies to cautious updates about our lives. Jessica and Doug had sold their house and moved into a small apartment. Doug had found steady work again. She was 6 months sober from gambling and working part-time at a local bookstore. It's not much, but it's honest work, she said. First time in years I've felt clean, I guess. Not waiting for the next scheme or big win. Your grandfather would be proud, I said. He valued honest work above all else. Her smile was sad, but genuine. I wish I'd understood him better while he was alive. All those conversations about business principles and financial responsibility, I thought he was just being boring and stingy. Now I realize he was trying to teach me something important. As we prepared to leave, Jessica hesitated. The financial counseling program in Grandpa's will, I've been going for 3 months now. The counselor says I'm making good progress. That's wonderful, Jess. I'm not doing it for the trust fund, she added quickly. I'm doing it because I need to learn how to manage money properly. But I thought you should know, as executor. I'll make a note in the trust documentation, I promised. We parted with a tentative hug, the first physical contact in nearly a year. As I watched her walk to her car, I felt the first real hope that healing was possible. Over the following months, our relationship slowly rebuilt on new foundations. Jessica continued her recovery programs with determination. Patrick, relieved that family rifts were mending, organized small gatherings where we could interact in low-pressure settings. 9 months after court, Jessica proudly showed me her progress report from the financial counseling program. 3 more months, she said. Then I'll have met Grandpa's condition. He knew what he was doing, I observed. Setting up a path that would help you more than just money ever could. She nodded thoughtfully. The trust conditions seemed controlling and unfair when I first heard them. Now I understand they were actually the most generous thing he could have done. 1 year after the court hearing, we gathered at Frank's favorite restaurant to commemorate both his passing and Jessica's completion of the financial counseling program. Patrick and his family came, as did Doug, whose relationship with Jessica had strengthened through their shared challenges. Jessica presented her counseling completion certificate and proof of gambling sobriety, along with a debt reduction plan she'd successfully implemented over the past year. According to the terms of the trust, I explained, you now have access to the funds Dad set aside. The distribution structure ensures long-term security rather than a lump sum. The old me would have hated that, Jessica admitted. The new me appreciates the wisdom behind it. There's something else, I added, removing an envelope from my jacket. Something your grandfather left with his attorney to be given to you only when you completed the program. Jessica opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a letter in Frank's handwriting and a small black and white photo of him as a young man in military uniform. Dear Jessica, she read aloud, her voice catching. If you're reading this, you've chosen the harder but better path. I'm proud of you. The journey you've undertaken is one I understand more than you might know. When I returned from service, I struggled with drinking and gambling myself. It took losing nearly everything before I found my way back. The discipline and principles that saved me are the same ones I've tried to share with you all these years. The trust fund represents not just money, but my belief in your ability to overcome challenges as I once did. With love, Grandpa." Jessica looked up, tears streaming freely now. "I had no idea he went through something similar." "He rarely spoke of that time," I said gently, "but it shaped his philosophy about money and responsibility. It's why he was so concerned when he saw similar patterns emerging." "I wish I could tell him I finally understand," Jessica said, carefully folding the letter. "In a way, you just did," Patrick observed, "by making the changes he hoped you would." As the evening wound down, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year, from the pain of betrayal to the beginning of healing. We had all been changed by the experience, in ways both painful and ultimately constructive. Later that week, I visited Dad's grave, something I did regularly, but which felt particularly significant now. The spring sunshine warmed the simple headstone as I told him about Jessica's progress, the family's gradual healing, and the impact his foresight continued to have on all of us. "You knew what you were doing all along," I said, placing fresh flowers beside the stone, setting up consequences but also providing a path to redemption. "It wasn't about the money at all, was it? It was about the values that matter more." The lessons of the past year had crystallized into something I would carry forward. That love sometimes requires difficult boundaries, that true generosity isn't always giving people what they want, and that the most valuable inheritance isn't counted in dollars, but in wisdom, resilience, and the courage to begin again after mistakes. As I stood to leave, I noticed a small figure waiting respectfully at a distance. Jessica. She approached slowly, carrying her own flowers. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said. I wanted to thank him too. "You're not intruding at all," I replied, making room for her beside me. "I think he'd be very happy to see us here together." Have you ever had to make difficult decisions about family relationships that caused short-term pain but led to long-term healing? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear that even the deepest family conflicts can find resolution. Thank you for listening to my story, and I wish you wisdom and compassion in your own family journeys.